Hi, this is Dominic with ASM. In this video, I'm going to deconstruct what I did in the performance of exploring a Hydrasynth Patch Evolution, as well as how I came up with the patch. You can download the patch below with the modulation cheat sheet and get a deeper understanding throughout the exploration. It is a single patch that you can run on any Hydrasynth. When I conceptualized the performance, I set the goal to create and perform using a single patch on the Hydrasynth Explorer. The patch should demonstrate the depth of its engine and wide variety of things you can achieve on this compact instrument, in real time, in one take, without overdubbing. The fully arranged track was formed by individual evolving layers. Since the patch creation involved sound design, layering, arranging, mixing, and performing, I had to plan everything ahead. As you can see, with latch on, I played the first note at the beginning and the patch kept rolling. Since envelope 2 is hardwired to amp, envelope 2 was kept open all the time with maximum release, so when I played the keys later, other elements didn't get cut. I chose unison in voice polyphony with slight detune and analog feel. Stereo width almost maxed out. With this setting, I can have a wide sound image even before touching the panning parameters. The kick might sound atypical that it's not centered, but you'd get an interesting result of phase cancellation between unison voices that caused the drum part to sound organic and constantly evolving by itself. Now let's get into the fun part of layering. You might have already realized that names of 6 parts were shown at the bottom. They were the 3 oscillators: ring modulation, noise, and self-oscillating filter 1. Active ones are lit up in orange, so you can easily tell the sounds of each part throughout the video. Parts were sequenced by LFOs that ran with trick sync off, which meant all ran in sync with the internal clock. To have filter 1 reserved for drum and bass generation, besides noise, everything else was routed to filter 2, and the filters were set in parallel. For the 3 oscillators, I assigned envelopes 3 to 5 and LFOs 3 to 5 to modulate oscillators 1 to 3. For instance, envelope 3 opens up volume of oscillator 1, and LFO 3 controls the pitch of oscillator 1. The same goes for oscillator 2 and 3. Trick source of envelope 3 and 4 were set to LFO 3 and 4 respectively. These LFOs ran in step mode. When they advance a step, the relevant envelope will get triggered. They act like 2 sequencer tracks. With semi-lock turned on, it's easy to modify the pitch of each step to form a melody in the step page. LFO 3 controlling the pitch of oscillator 1 was the main driving sequence, so I kept it as a 8-step sequence. To make it sound more interesting, I set LFO 4, which was controlling the pitch of oscillator 2, to run double the rate of LFO 3, with 7 steps to create a polymeter that kept evolving. Oscillator 1 ran in wave scan mode through 2 mutants, one in FM mode and one in harmonic mode. In the FM mutant with the internal sine wave source, the ratio was set slightly off from 0.5 with high feedback to thicken the sound. Oscillator 2 remained in the simplest form of single saw wave through 2 mutants, FM and oscillator sync. These mutants get modified with the macro, which we will talk about later. Oscillator 3 was the sound I played on keypad at the end. It had a waveform with rather rich harmonics to stand out from the context. This was the only element that responded to the keybed. I set the key track to 99% so it would not track perfectly and sound less stable. The key track settings of oscillator 1, oscillator 2, filter 1 and filter 2 were all set to 0%. LFO5 modulated oscillator 3, but a bit differently. A constant stream of smoothed pulse waves controlled the level of oscillator 3 to create a tremolo effect. Since oscillator 3 served as a real-time performing sound, several modulations were added to bring up the expressiveness. Note-on velocity was mapped to control depth of modulation between envelope 5 and reverb dry-wet. Aftertouch was mapped to the sustain of envelope 5 and cutoff of filter 2. So when extra force was applied on the keys, the notes got emphasized. These were the tricks applied to make it distinct. Ring modulation had its sources set to oscillator 1 and oscillator 2, which had two separate pitch sequences running in different rates and step lengths. The result was an evolving layer of ring mod sounds. It provided gritty side of elements to the mix. It followed the same envelope triggers of the oscillator 2, which was envelope 4. Now, let's dive into the most complex part, the self-oscillating filter 1. Filter 1 was set to low-pass FET12, with maximum resonance to self-oscillate, so it can generate its own sound. LFO2 was the core modulator that shaped the whole thing very deeply. Since I wanted the filter 1 to completely rely on LFO2, key track of filter 1 was turned all the way down to 0%. The drum and bass parts were the sounds of filter 1 itself, and leaks from noise through filter 1. LFO2 ran in step mode with a length of 32 steps, in a rather high rate of 16th notes, basically 4 steps in a beat, which allowed to sequence both the cutoff and resonance parameters to achieve the contrast between kick and other percussions and bass. The envelope 1 amount was applied to achieve pitch modulation for filter 1's self-oscillation. Besides, an extra mapping of LFO2 to envelope 1 decay made the outcome more dynamic. Mapping of LFO2 to noise volume also shaped the cymbal-like sounds. For the kick sound, it triggered on every downbeat, which the LFO1 was set to. That became the trick source for the envelope 1. The envelope with extremely short decay made the filter kick very snappy. The envelope 1 amount was modified midway in the performance for harsher kick afterwards. I spent a while experimenting in the step edit page of LFO2 to create a balance between kick, bass, noise, and other sound effects. Since tuning of this sequence required high accuracy, I even created a spreadsheet to keep track of the repeating phrase while adding variations. The result was a roughly tuned kick and bass that provided the rawness with a glitchy rhythmic pattern. The part at 3 minutes 56 was still the same thing. The transposed self-oscillation required special attention to have the transposed melody to stay in tune. Each part's level control was mapped to individual macro controls. Of course, the macro controls control more than just volume. They morph the sounds simultaneously. We'll touch on that later. As mentioned previously, envelope 1 had a simple short decay shape that made the kick punch. It was also mapped inverse to the level of oscillator 2 and ring modulator, which acted like a tight sidechain compressor to avoid too much spectral contents clashing at downbeats. With the same concept, the macro controls that acted as level knobs would influence the level modulators of adjacent elements, so that boosting ring modulation would modify oscillator 1's decay time and oscillator 2's decay and sustain at the same time. This made sure other elements would give way when the leading row got under the spotlight. All elements had their own pan positions set in the mixer module. Moreover, both oscillator 1 and oscillator 2 had a key track style panning effect, like what you would hear when playing a piano. This was achieved by mapping the sequencing LFOs to the oscillator pans. Oscillator 2 with negative depth gave an opposite direction instead. Panning of ring modulation was controlled by LFO 2, which was originally driving the drum and bass. Panning of noise was controlled by oscillator 2's controllers, envelope 4 and LFO 4. These further created some audible linkages when heard together with other elements. Finally, oscillator 3 had the simplest key track panning, simply mapped key track to oscillator 3's pan. As mentioned earlier, LFO3 and LFO4, which sequenced the pitch of oscillator 1 and oscillator 2, had semi-lock turned on in step mode to quickly determine the pitch in each step accurately. Key track of these oscillators were turned off. Therefore, they were centered to middle C. The steps I set were all inside of the key of C minor. The drum and bass generated by the self-oscillating filter 1 were tuned to the key by ears instead. This was a unison patch, which meant there was always only one note playing at a time. It was impossible to play chords directly on the keys. The chords you heard were a combination of sequenced oscillators from different parts, and of course the bass notes established by the bass sound from the self-oscillating filter. The pitch band strip was the controller that dictates the chord movements. Pitch band setting in voice menu was set to 5 semitones. The neutral position remained C. Top position with an upward transposition of 5 semitones ended up to F. Bottom position with a downward transposition of 5 semitones ended up to G. It then became very easy to switch between C minor, F minor, and G minor chords. The pitch band controlled all oscillators by default. I had to add a mapping from the pitch band to the cutoff frequency of filter 1, with depth of 5.0, so the self-oscillating part got transposed collectively. Chord glide was achieved by slowly sliding on the pitch band strip. Because pitch band transposition was used, when the pitch band was not in its neutral position, I had to play the keys with an offset against the pitch band transposition. The cheat sheet of modulation mappings sorted by sound layers can be downloaded as mentioned. You should be able to see the big picture at a glimpse. Most of the modulations in the mod matrix were already explained. Now let's move on to the macros. The macros allow you to achieve much more complex results than one parameter per knob mapping. I'm going to share all the tricks I used with the macro knobs and macro buttons. One trick I used a lot was creating converse modulations, some with positive depth, others with negative depth. As mentioned in the mixing chapter, when I introduced an element, a couple of others would give way subtly. They could be shorter decay, longer attack, lower level, or other elements. I use this trick a lot on sound design because I prefer to maintain a balanced level throughout macro changes when volume change is not the purpose. It also ensures drastic volume changes would not occur when you do multiple macros at a time. For instance, the volume might not be ideal at certain sweet spots with a mutant. Setting negative amounts to amp level becomes the key to counteract any boost. In this particular patch, Macro 8 increased the filter drive to the max. I used another slot with negative depth to amp level to counteract the drive gain. When editing the macro, I auditioned the knob range to make sure every point sounds right, especially on the complex ones. The next trick I used also relates to leveling. Maxed out volume modulation was duplicated in macro edit slots. This allowed me to quickly jump from 0 to max level with a minimum knob movement, creating a steeper linear relationship. This setting made both fading and jumping possible with a single knob. Apart from direct parameter control with macros, several macros were set to activate existing modulation mapping in the mod matrix, or modify the intensity of it. You can route a macro to control the modulation amount of any mod matrix routing. After talking about the macro knobs, let's move on to the macro buttons. To achieve those instantaneous macro button triggers, I set macro button setting in the system setup pages to trigger instead of the default toggle mode. Keep in mind that you do not lose the ability to hold the macro buttons. You can always hold Shift while pressing the macro buttons to hold them. Being able to do both allows you to free up your hands for something else, while retaining the ability to manipulate the buttons quickly. Macro buttons allow an immediate jump of values. The button value in each slot of macros 2, 3, and 4 were left untouched, which was 0. It acted as the most straightforward on-off switch, disabling any knob change. Macro knobs lack the ability to jump in value. However, if you combine it with macro button, you can easily achieve jumpy results. In this part, macro 4 was the ring mod. I occasionally triggered the macro button to return the macro to 0 position while increasing the macro knob value. The result was a series of alternating jumps between 0 and an increased step in each iteration. The previous example showed how you could have both the macro knob and button to control the same modulation destinations. In fact, you can assign macro knob and buttons to different modulation destinations, or share destinations but set with different intensities or even polarities. In this patch, macro 1, 5, 6, 7, and 8 were assigned this way. Macro 6 and 7 were the most obvious ones. They controlled oscillator 1 and oscillator 2 levels. The knobs controlled their levels, but the buttons controlled the rate of LFOs that sequenced the oscillators. The results were temporary changes of rate with triplets. I paired them up with muted drum and bass parts as fills. To achieve interesting usable results from combination of multiple macros, their combined effect should be auditioned and refined beforehand. The concept of balance mentioned earlier plays a big role. Lastly, here's a series of techniques that are used in the performance. Rhythmic movements were important. It was applied to everything from filter cutoff to macro knobs and buttons, and even the wetness of reverb, which was controlled by the mod strip. Here, I held random and tapped the waveform selection of oscillator 1. It's a great technique you can apply to any parameters, and you can get a lot of happy accidents from it. It works kind of like a manual sample and hold controller. Effect of gradual build and instant cue can be easily achieved by using both macro knob and button. In order to get that subtle but interesting hard sync effect, the tweaking must focus on the area of sweet spot. Again, I tweaked it rhythmically and scrolled with the Shift button held from time to time to get the finer pitch changes that I desired. Don't forget that you can scroll more knobs with one hand at a time. With smoothness applied to the LFO4 sequence, it made Oscillator 2 glide between steps. A new polymeter was achieved midway through the song by changing LFO4's step length from 7 to 5. At the end, I entered mod matrix and slowly applied modulation from envelope 4 to oscillator 3's pitch for the final sound effect. I also applied aftertouch rhythmically and gradually boosted the reverb till the end. Hope you learned some new techniques in this video, and that you'll try out and apply them in your own creation soon. Feel free to leave your comments below and tell us what videos you'd like to see in the future.